Greetings. Welcome to the class of Secret Jews of the Iberian Peninsula. My name is Alienor Hathaway. I live in the East Kingdom, and I started this kind of interest about 10 years ago in college. I just want to give a little bit of a brief introduction. And I will be going over a vocabulary, the simplified crypto-Jewish timeline of Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, the Inquisition process, some of the crypto-Jewish customs, and then there's an abundance of resources for further study. I have a little bit of my personal modern background is I come from a European history, Jewish Ashkenazi, which means Eastern European on my father's side and Christian on my mother's. So the two combined cultures are of interest to me in that way. By doing a little bit of research, we may even have some Sephardic background, but it's very hazy. Just as a sort of introduction, Ashkenazi is Eastern European. Sephardic is the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula. That includes usually Spain and Portugal, but it sometimes is exemplified by people who live outside of that territory now, but hold those cultures. I'm going to explore the history of crypto-Judaism, mostly as it comes to post-1492, but we'll be looking at the timeline of what led it to that. And I should point out that I will mention some of the torture used in the Inquisition process. If that is a content issue for you, I will give a content warning so you can sort of fast forward and rejoin us when you come away from that difficulty. I feel that discussing it is very important because the individuals who suffered under it deserve to be remembered and deserve to know the heinousness of that. There's a lot of information out there. You may be familiar with other sources. This is my best compilation of Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, not necessarily the crypto Jews of other cultures. There were secret Jews and secret Muslims and secret Christians all over the European world. So it's worthwhile, if that's of interest to you, to take a look at that. Just as a way of introduction, Spain and Portugal are allowing and giving modern day citizenship to those who can prove that their ancestors were forced to leave in 1492. So this kind of history is not actually that old. It's old enough, but many people still have a memory of it. So these are some stories from the Atlantic. There's stories that show up day to day in newspapers all over. And most recently in 2019, a Jewish convert discovered she wasn't actually a convert at all, and that her ancestors had been crypto Jews all along, and the recipes were found just right there in her cookbook, and that cookbook is now available widely to the general public. So it's just sort of an overview of how Jews came to be in Christian Spain. Spanish Jews and especially Portuguese Jews as well were once the largest and most prosperous Jews in the community. They lived in the area as early as the 17th century. I use before Common Era instead of before Christ. It's a scholarly thing. And the same thing, I don't use the year of the Lord AD, I use the Common Era CE. The invasion brought most of the Iberian Peninsula under a Visigoth rule by the early 5th century. And then in 711, the Sephardim's lives changed because the Muslims welcomed the Jews of Iberia. Under Muslim rule in the Caliphate, anybody who was considered the people of the book under the Abrahamic faiths could live in relative peace. There was a specific kind of tax that was given to non-Muslims, but there was sort of a tolerance. And they did thrive under that caliphate. But the gradual reconquest of the Catholic kingdoms in Spain sort of started to lead to some of the problems. There was some discrimination, but Jews had many high positions like court, doctors, and a lot of other high respected positions. They lived at relative peace with their neighbors. This is a map. It comes from a history of the Jews in Christian Spain, which is by Bernard Baer. It just shows many of the Jewish and converso communities as of 1474. You can see that there were Jews and individuals who were recognized under that community living all over. Kind of a way, it's a geographical thing. There were many, many Jews living in this part of the world. So I'm going over some vocabulary. If there's any issues that you need clarification, I'm kind of happy to point them out, but there's a lot. You'll have to forgive some of my pronunciation. So animism is the coerced in Hebrew. This was Jews who were forced to convert to another religion by force, in this case, Christianity. Apostate is one who renounced their religion. It meant different things altogether. The Spanish Inquisition used it to refer to crypto-Jews who renounced Christianity. An auto de fe is an act of faith. Is a public penance of condemned heretics. It was really, I think a lot of people think everyone was burned at the stake, or that was the whole point of it, but it was a public festival in some ways that showed not just the condemned being burned at the stake, but reconciliation. The biggest term is converso. That's a Jew who converted to Catholicism in Spain or Portugal during the 14th and 15th centuries. It's often still used today to refer to the descendants of converts. I think a lot of people have heard of the term marrano, and I'm going to talk about that one a little later, but marrano actually means swine or dirty one. So it's not a term that a person who is rather involuntarily or voluntarily converted what it wanted to be called. Regardless, converso is very much a neutral term. A Cristiano Nuevo, a new Christian, was the people who were converted to Christianity from Judaism, and actually it mentions Islam as well. There's a later on, as sort of hierarchy becomes the lay of the land, it becomes part of an idea of a cleanliness of the blood. So it excludes new Christians from higher levels of society by differentiating those who are old Christians, Cristiano Viejo, and those who are not. And it was supposed to be that if you converted to Christianity, you were Christian and stop. But that's not the way it turned out, which is why a lot of crypto Jews sort of form the way they do. Crypto Jews as a term is used scholarly as a secret practice of Judaism while publicly professing to be Catholic. It's used to describe even the descendants who ended up maintaining Jewish rituals and traditions, even to their own surprise. So some people discover 5, 10 generations down the line that they have Jewish rituals in their Catholicism. And that's kind of where I first got interested in a lot of this research. So heresy is a doctrine at variance with the established religious beliefs. And you'll find that Christians use it to mean one thing and Jews and crypto Jews use it to mean another. A Judaizer was somebody who was living according to Jewish customs. This was one of the major accusations of the Spanish Inquisition and that they had against conversos. Ladino is Judeo-Spanish. It's a language that is very much influenced by Spain and the language of Spain, but it uses Hebrew letters. As I mentioned before, Marrano is a derogatory term for the descendants, either of the descendants of Jewish converts or those who converted themselves. Meshumad, just as a thing, is an apostate in Hebrew, and this is where we're talking about those Jews who converted to Christianity by choice. A Morisco, just as an idea, I really focus on Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, but there's a whole other set of scholarship on those who were Muslim who were forced to convert to Christianity. A San Benito was a penitential garment. It was decorated in yellow and other kinds of sort of cartoonish decorations. It was meant to humiliate the person wearing it. Sephardim is a Jewish descendant from the Iberian Peninsula, and it includes just somebody descended from the Iberian Peninsula who is Jewish, and it includes those who left the peninsula. Many ended up in the Netherlands or Turkey. The Spanish Inquisition was established in 1478, and is actually very distinguished from the Christian Inquisition that's under the papal control in Rome. It was to ensure the orthodoxy of those who converted, and it's a very difficult concept. It's forced into the Catholicism as well as the nationalism of Spain. So next, I'm going to give you kind of a very simplified crypto-Jewish timeline. A lot of this, there is miles and miles worth of scholarship, but I just want to sort of share some of the basics. So the biggest sort of timeline is up until 1392, there's sort of an increase, but many Jews were left quite enough to sort of mind their own business and serve even under Christian Spain. But in 1392, there was a massacre of Jews across Spain and a massive forced conversion in Seville. And then starting in 1408, there was the forced move of those who had not converted into Jewish quarters and ghettos. It's of note that that had not been part of the equation for Jews in Spain up until that point. And it just sort of came along. There's more and more of this. And so starting in 1460, there was a published book by Alfonso de Espina that was The Fortress Against Jews, Muslims, and Other Enemies of the Christian Faith, which influenced a lot of those in power. So by the time 1469 and Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile had married, there's a gradual and continued reconquest of bringing all of Spain under Christian rule and pushing out those who were not Christian. In 1478, about a decade after the marriage, the Pope Sixtus IV authorized the Spanish Inquisition at the request of Ferdinand and Isabella. And starting just 2 years later, the Inquisition had its first active tribunal in Seville again, so going back to that 1392, and they're targeting the conversos that were suspected of apostasy. In 1481, there was the first Edict of Grace and the Auto de Fe. I am going to show and explain what those are very soon. So if you're curious what an Edict of Grace is, it's just so you know that this is sort of the timeline we're going on. And so by 1492 is when the Alhambra Decree forced the majority of Jews in Spain, which was estimated at 200,000 to 250,000, to either convert to Catholicism or leave. 1496, the Jews who were in Spain, many had moved to Portugal, or there were still Jews who were native to Portugal. They were forced to convert when the Princess of Portugal was going to marry a Spanish prince. The problem with this is Manuel did not want to lose his Jewish sort of benefits like Spain had, so he forced everybody to convert, and they were basically given 20 years to get used to the idea. So by 1539, they introduced the Inquisition in Portugal. And then even in 1571, New Spain and Mexico gets the Inquisition. It isn't until 1821 that the Inquisition ends in Portugal. And it wasn't until 1826 that the last public execution, in this case by hanging, was ordered by the Inquisition. And it didn't end in Spain, the Spanish Inquisition, until 1834. That's past the period we're talking about, but I think people are very surprised to know that's how long it was active. Right. So somebody who is a converso, oftentimes when they found themselves in this world, you have to think about it from their perspective. They probably, maybe their ancestors are converted, maybe it was for genuine Christian faith, maybe it was because there was a certain benefit to be had by becoming Christian, like you didn't have as many penalties, you weren't limited to a ghetto. Some people were genuine converts, some weren't. But the biggest thing is the net was getting smaller and smaller. It was getting harder and harder to be Jewish. And by 1492, you didn't really have much choice. I think a lot of people just don't understand why they didn't just leave. But the biggest thing to think about is at the Alhambra, they were not allowed to take anything with them. They could take just enough to get by, and very few countries wanted them. There are stories of people who were brought onto ships, their money was taken that they had left, and then they were drowned at sea or just sold into slavery someplace else down the line. So for somebody finding themselves in this circumstance, it's a very difficult one. So a lot of people converted. Some maybe were genuine, some maybe had mixed feelings about it, but they didn't have a lot of time to learn to get used to their faith. In the instances of Seville, they were just straight up converted without at gunpoint. Basically, it wasn't gunpoint, but knife point. And some of them rather would die than take that. So when the Inquisition comes to your town, there's sort of a general edict of faith. That means you are invited to rat out your friends and neighbors and family, and you're also invited to rat out yourself, to go and confess. And if you do that, they carefully keep records about everything. The Inquisition was incredible at record keeping. That's why we know so much. And so under this general edict, you were given a very light penance, but you had to let others know what was going on. This is kind of a thing we'll see again and again in history. If you did not do an edict, if you did not get part of the faith, there was an attempt at reconciliation. So those were, again, sort of light penalties. Maybe if you confessed at that stage, you would end up in a church reconciliation, a light penalty, a light fine. But one thing you should know about most of the Inquisition process is it was assumed you were guilty. There was none of this innocent until proven guilty. It was guilty unless we could prove otherwise, and we're pretty sure you are. So in any instance, if someone confessed and were reconciled to the church, there might be a light fine, there might be penalties like imprisonment or enslavement, but it wasn't as bad as it might end up in the future. I'm going to talk a little bit quite soon about the psychological and physical torture. I would say join us back at the next slide if that is an issue for you. Be aware. So the way that the Inquisition process worked, torture and psychological torture were not like their primary plan. It wasn't like we are definitely here to torture you, but because of the experience people had with them, that is definitely an Inquisition coming. That is already the mindset you were having, is they might psychologically torture me, they might come after my family, they might harm me. So if you didn't confess to being a heretic at that previous kind of thing, you were following the Jewish faith in secret, they would do psychological torture. That means they would interrogate you, they would ask you everything. And there are transcripts again and again where they sort of honed in on Jewish people's food. So what they ate at home, if they were avoiding pork, especially their attitudes in secret, how they secretly felt to things. They would interrogate the servants, they would interrogate neighbors and family, and slowly kind of hone in a net. If the interrogation didn't get somebody to confess, they would just give you a tour of the instruments that they had. Those sorts of torture instruments is psychological enough, and it's pretty scary if you're in the situation. If somebody confessed, you return to that reconciliation phase. If there was no confession, that's when they would do psychological torture. That means they would use the rack, they would use a pulley, they would waterboard. The biggest point, and I mean, it's a tenuous, but the torture was under church supervision, but only civil authorities could draw blood. So that means in any instance, like they're tied up with the church, but they are technically secular. So assuming you go through this and there's usually a confession or a defiance. Without a confession, you're presumed guilty. If you are released from imprisonment, there are fines, there are the loss of your reputation, which was very, very important in this culture. And there is the careful watch by officials and parish church leaders to make sure you don't relapse in the future. If you're sentenced to an auto de fe, apart from the actual execution, which is only if you relapse from your heresy again, You could be reconciled to the church, you could be flogged, you could go to prison, you could lose your property, you could be exiled to another place, or you could be sentenced to enslavement in a royal galley ship, which in many instances was basically a death sentence. So this is probably the most difficult section. If you were a relapsed, unrepentant heretic, you were relaxed to the secular authorities, and there was a great coercion to try to get you to reconcile or confess. If you did that, you were not going to be spared. If you were a second, so relapse meant that if you'd been under heresy before and followed it up by continuing to follow converso Jewish concepts, the body would be, somebody would be strangled before your body was burned, but it was still burned. An auto de fe was attended by everyone in town. There would be an all-night vigil, usually with the whole religious community, and it would end with a mass at daybreak, and then they would be taken to outside of town in a procession, wearing their sanbenitos, holding a repentant candle, and then the sentence was announced usually that day. Oftentimes they had no idea if they were going to be allowed to go home, if they were going to be allowed to be reconciled, or if they were going to be executed. So you can just imagine kind of the psychological feelings of anybody who's a converso at this point. The prisoners were taken to a place outside the city walls, a burning place, and the sentences were read. Those who determined they would be reconciled were given last rites and confession, and then the public execution was given out to the rest. Again, this process was for relapsed or unrepentant secret Jews. It was also Muslims, Protestants, other kind of unorthodox considered heretics, and then other religious crimes. I've largely focused on the attitudes to those who were Judaizers, which was a big focus of the Spanish Inquisition. Are there any questions at this point? There's a lot there, and I'm not sure if it can be a little hard. So
nothing in the chat so far.
Okay. So I think this is probably the most interesting. We're kind of done with discussing the Inquisition process, and I'm going to discuss crypto-Jewish customs. One sort of caveat to this is crypto-Jewish customs are not the end all. Each household, each community, each sort of area had their own customs. So nothing is be all end all. There's just some that are very well documented, often because of the Spanish Inquisition, and then later because of family traditions. Probably my favorite anecdote is I once taught this class years ago when I was sort of new to it. And I was explaining a bunch of these customs, and one of the attendees turned out his family did these customs, and his family did in fact have secret Jewish ancestry. Just as an idea to get what things might have looked like. This is an altar piece from a location, and it's Christ among the doctors. You can see it's not just Jesus in the time frame he was alive. This is actually showing Jews, probably actually active Jews. Jews were forced to attend churches if they, at the time when they weren't forced converted, to be preached at for that they were going to hell. So up until 1492, every few months they would be herded into the church and forced to listen to an overview of Christianity. So the beliefs varied a great deal, but the biggest thing is it's like the game of telephone. Consider that the first generation who'd had Jewish concepts and Jewish beliefs, or if they were converted but had friends, neighbors, and relatives who were still Jewish, they had a much better idea of the Jewish customs. The farther and farther away you get, 100 years past, you have a much different view of what your religion is now, because it's been colored by Catholicism. It's been colored by sort of a persecution of your own beliefs. So one thing that I read about was they made a very big distinction between their use of God. So Dios versus Dio. probably made no difference to some, but it was some that they would hone in on. In Judaism, there's no Messiah yet. The Messiah has yet to arrive. Jesus Christ is not the Messiah to Jewish faith. And so Jews remembered that their Messiah had yet to arrive, but how they sort of ended up getting the concept of salvation mixed up. So Jews don't really have salvation as its major faith. A lot of Judaism, and I'm not going to get into theology, but is largely about following the rules, commandments of the law of Moses, the Torah. And there's a lot of debate and discussion within it about the nuances of law. But when you're far away from those laws, especially the concept and communication and commentary in the Talmud, you're finding yourself in a different world. So salvation through the laws of Moses became the belief of many of these conversos and crypto Jews. A lot of them felt that God's response to their behavior and lack of respect for the law is why they were persecuted in Spain. So there was a lot of focus on repentance. There was also unusually a belief in Jewish saints. So the Old Testament, which is the Jewish Hebrew Bible, said that Moses, Joshua, Aaron, Susanna, Judith, Esther were saints. And that was that they were a one and better saints than the Catholic saints. I can't stress enough the importance of the home. In modern world, and today even, Jewish life is tied to the home, but is also tied to going to the house of study, the synagogue. That's where a lot of men study all the time if they can between working. And so the home and the synagogue were two very important places. But if you no longer have a synagogue you can safely go to because somebody might report or find out about it, you have to find ways of following your faith at home and in secret. So this is where Inquisition asked questions about food very, very often. So as much as possible, there was attempts to keep the kosher laws. You probably heard of that. Jews avoid pork and shellfish and basically bottom dwellers and scavengers. Meat and milk are separate and not eaten at the same meal. And there's a whole abundance of other customs that might not be familiar with. A big one that many Jewish women do to this day is in remembrance of the sacrifice at the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, when they're making the bread for the Sabbath, that Shabbat on Friday nights, they take a pinch of the dough for the challah bread and throw it into the fire as a ritual sacrifice. That was something that they were familiar with in the Inquisition as well. One of my favorite dietary things was finding a recipe that looked like pork chops, but turned out to very much be like French toast. It was a bread. It's perfect. It's brilliant. And I've seen the image of it and it looks just like that. It looks just like a pork chop, but it is a bread, an egg bread. The adaptation of Catholic fasting. I mean, Jews have fasts on Yom Kippur and certain other holidays, but a lot of Jews who were lost contact, fasting became a frequent aspect of their faith because Catholics were fasting. So they could just sort of ease it into their day-to-day practices. The biggest one was trying to keep the Shabbat, the Sabbath. Jews do not cook or do work on the holy day. And so on Shabbat, they would make overnight kind of a slow cooked meal that was absolutely delicious, to tell you. It was usually some kind of meat dish. And that way they didn't have to cook. They could just stoke up the coals and it would stay warm. Sort of, you could do that with a slow cooker today. A big thing for those who were caught, that's the ones who ended up the Inquisition, was very negative attitudes toward Christianity. They would mock, they would have sort of a humor in disbelief. They might intentionally disrespect or inflict harm on icons or crucifixes. there was a especially negative attitude to the idea of a Virgin Mary. The idea of a virgin birth was something that the Jewish folks just couldn't get their head around. They avoided the saints apart from their own concept of Jewish saints. Oftentimes, there would be every attempt possible to avoid going to church with the excuse of being ill, or they might turn away or talk during the elevation of the host. And then there would be certain rituals each family had to negate Catholic observances. So that might mean after they would go to and have like baptism or some kind of anointing, they would rub the oil off with water and or say something to negate every time they would cross themselves. A lot of this were things that got them caught. And later and later in the history of the Inquisition, these kinds of concepts then meant that even if somebody was innocently having an issue, they would be the target, that they were crypto Jews, even if many they might not be. Or maybe just because they were descended from conversos didn't mean that they were following Jewish rituals. But it was like if somebody didn't like pork, then that might make them an emphasis on the Inquisition. Rituals of the life cycle continued to be very important to the secret Jews. There would be two names. Basically, when people became conversos, they lost their Jewish name in official documents. So they would be given a Hispanic family name. Oftentimes, these might be names that were very common, like Lopez, but Jews used sort of a patronymic. So somebody is Miriam, and then it would be Bas Raphael. So Miriam, the daughter of Raphael. So they would get a Jewish name that would be their secret one. They would be given a Christian name. If at all possible, they would try to do the Brit, the 8 days after circumcision, but that is something that was very difficult because it marks you off as being different. So you had to be very, very careful in any kind of situation, especially like if a convert's descendant joined the army or anything where people were naked together. They, as I mentioned, they often would wash off the place of holy oil in baptism. As you can imagine, children talk a lot. Children share and have a very hard time keeping secrets. So they had to also keep secrets from their own children. They would be told about their heritage possibly when they were old enough not to give it away. So that might be what they considered the ages of reason, 11 to 14. Sometimes households did it. Girls became adults in Judaism at age 12, boys at age 13. So they might be told that when they were of age. As before, the home becomes the center of the faith. So you end up with very close-knit communities and families because you can't share or give these away. So there's also instances where a single member of the family is dedicated to the church as a friar, a monk, nun, and that way they alleviate the suspicion from everyone else. And that's really curious, but there are plenty of stories of this. And in some instances, they might be actual genuine converts, and sometimes, again, they might be somebody who is playing a role. Marriage between these communities, again, had to be between relatives and close friends. And you'll still see this in sort of the genetic makeup of Jewish communities to this day. People are very closely related by necessity. So there was two ceremonies. There would be a home private ceremony. In Jewish beliefs, there's usually a contract, this beautifully illuminated ritual contract of marriage. And the bride and groom are considered the king and queen on their wedding day. And so they are under a canopy, just like royalty. Those are sort of rituals that obviously if somebody were to look in, they would mark it as Jewish. So you had to have a home ceremony that was very small with just, if not a rabbi, a family member who could be trusted or a friend who could be trusted. They tried to remember rituals, but again, the farther and farther you get away, the less likely you are to remember. People who are sincere converts would often seek to marry those of non-Jewish descent, and then with the rest would marry within the community. An actual example of Saint Teresa of Avila was the granddaughter of somebody who'd been considered a heretic but reconciled to the church and were genuine converts. So this was all over Spain. Many people probably, maybe ones we don't know. Jewish death was very important. A lot of people were familiar by this point with the last rites, which Jews don't do, but there were customs that were known at the time. So some who maybe had been practicing Christians for years wanted to die as Jews. So they would avoid the last rites. One custom that's mentioned again and again in the resources is that they would turn the deceased's face to the wall, or somebody who was on his way to death would be face to the wall. There's a note in 2 Kings where Hezekiah was dying, and they turned his face to a wall, and he lived 15 more years miraculously. So I think it might have been trying to remember. A lot of Jewish customs are the prayers for the dead in Jewish customs are much different than they are in the Christian faith. Jewish customs say that even the major prayer for the death never mentions death once. It's saying that you're bringing, like if you're in deep mourning, that having spoken a prayer together about the glory of God brings the deceased back to you in some way. It was simple. There wasn't elaborate coffins. It was just to be buried in a shroud. Jewish customs require that the body be accompanied the entire time. So you try to come up with a way to make it so that a Jewish woman who died would have another Jewish woman with her, or a man would have a man with him. They have to, in Jewish custom, be buried as soon as possible, as long as it's not on the Sabbath. So you have to kind of find ways of making these rituals happen, and it can be very difficult, and you sometimes had to make painful decisions. Holy days were another thing. The Jewish Shabbat is considered a holiday. It's a holy day, and it comes and is given to the Jewish people weekly. And it would require the night before, the day before, preparation. So cleaning, preparing, getting food ready, so that you weren't cooking or working on the day of the Shabbat. There was always a tradition of lighting candles just as the night. So in Jewish custom, it happens the night before. Sundown the night before is the beginning of the next day, as far as ritual goes. And so they would light candles to bring in and welcome the Sabbath. And later, descendants would maybe go to the church on Friday night and light a candle to a specific saint, and they didn't know that's why they did it. Or other people might go down in their basement or their cellar and light a candle to a specific saint, not knowing that those rituals came to them from their ancestors. They would pray alone instead of and that's very painful. In the Jewish customs, you're supposed to pray at least 10 men together, is sort of the minimum quorum for Jews to pray. They would avoid work. They would shun the Sunday Sabbath, maybe working in private and making excuses to avoid math, and then those Shabbat stews I mentioned. They would try very hard to remember, but unlike Christianity that has sort of the solar calendar, we're looking at a lunar calendar in the Jewish faith. So you have fasts, you have to kind of think close to the season. So Yom Kippur is sometime in the fall. Purim is sometime in the spring. So you try to tie it as close as possible to what you remember. So Purim might be tied to Carnival. Yom Kippur might be tied to another saint feast. And descendants eventually didn't know the actual Jewish dates. And in later years, they would extend fasts because that was the only thing they could hold on to. Passover was a major holiday, and that's related.
This is your 10-minute warning.
Thank you very much. And they attempted to observe it. So the other holiday is Purim, and that is a holiday that I'm not going to get too deep into, but it celebrates the book of Esther, and Queen Esther had to hide her Judaism in order to be queen. And so that kind of hidden holiday is very significant to crypto Jews. So this is sort of my 10-minute. That was a lot, and there's still a ton. The very best resource out there on the secret life of crypto Jews is Secrecy and Deceit. David Giltowitz has been researching this for years. I got this book out of the library 10 times before I finally just caved in and bought it. It is the best resource on these sort of research on the rituals and beliefs of secret Jews. If you're interested in the inquisitional process in general, this is a very easy read. It's called God's Jury, The Inquisition in the Making of the Modern World. It's by Cullen Murphy. It's excellent. It looks at the Inquisition in general, but it does talk about the Spanish Inquisition. And really the process was the same. If you are interested in food, this is the book for you. A Drizzle of Honey, The Lives and Recipes of Spain's Secret Jews is absolutely incredible. It lays out recipes based off of the Inquisition's documents. So they would interview people about their ritual and food choices. And so this book actually is excellent for simple, easy to follow, modified recipes. Jeannie Milgram is the one who rediscovered or discovered her 15 generations worth of recipes of crypto Jews. This includes some more modern ones like from Cuba, Mexico. It's really difficult. A lot of the recipes aren't ones I could do, but if that pork chop one interests you, the French toast pork chop, that's the one. Jeannie also wrote an incredible book. You can read it in Spanish or English on the 15th grandmothers and her research and genealogy on discovering her ancestry. This is relatively new and it's a really great read. If fiction is your case, Richard Zimler's The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon is in Portugal. This is an excellent, well-researched murder mystery that takes place using a ritual Passover Haggadah. There is another lecture by somebody who's actually a professor and has a doctorate in this stuff. It's called Who Are the Crypto Jews? The Jews of Sepharad. It's also excellent. There are organizations for those who are interested or are descended of crypto Jews. That's the Society of Crypto Judaic Studies and the Association of Crypto Jews. My slides are available in, I think the online, or it should be online. And I can also email if anybody needs them any other way.
They've also been in the chat.
Thank you. There's websites out there on a whole bunch, including the journal. This one goes into the Italian crypto Jews as well. There's Sephardic genealogy resources. There's the timeline of the Inquisition, and then there's just a sort of overview of the Spanish Inquisition by more scholarly topics. I've got, I think, about 8 or so minutes, so I'm happy to take questions if you have them.
So we had one in the chat around the origins of the word challah.
Oh, I am sorry that I don't know that off the top of my head, but I'm a good researcher.
I do.
Oh, you do?
Yes. So challah comes from the Semitic root chet lamed lamed halal, which means either to pierce, to wound, or to take apart. So the word challah specifically refers to the portion taken out of both what we have come to know as challah, the bread, as well as the matzah. It is the sacrificial portion specifically. It became associated with the braided bread in after SCA period. But it also comes from the same root word in Arabic that turned into halal, as we understand it, for what you can allow for eating, because there was the portion that people were allowed to eat, there was the portion that was dedicated to the temple, and then there was the portion that was dedicated to the priests.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think I looked at that at some point, but it has been a while, and being of two faiths, I sometimes end up confused. But the rituals of food and eating were a very important aspect of all of this. I'm going to stop sharing, so if I can anybody does have questions. But yeah, it's crypto Judaism is a fascinating concept, and what I cover isn't even really the tip. There is so much out there, and it's a fascinating topic. And the Jews of the Sephardic, just there's so much wonderful things. I mean, their food, the culture, the music, and it's not as studied as I think it deserves to be.
Is anybody else having difficulty seeing the files that I added to the chat?
I downloaded them, but I haven't tried opening them.
Okay. If anybody would like them emailed directly to them, just let me know, and I am happy to do that. We have another question in the chat about resources on crypto Judaism in Italy.
That journal is probably your best starting point, and actually there are a fair number of them. My email, I don't think I have it in there, but you're welcome to email me, and I'm a librarian by training, so I can find some good resources. There are definitely Italian, I mean, Jews were kicked out of European communities and let back in all of the time, so there's a lot of differences in different communities. A lot of Italian Jews were allowed to stay under duress and with a lot of difficulty. So there are definitely crypto Jews in Italy. I just don't have as many resources because I focused on the ones. But that journal is a good place to start, and I can point you in some right direction if you email me. And please don't hesitate. I really love sending resources. I love it. It's fun.
Would you like me to add your email to the chat for everyone?
Please, that'd be great.
Okay. I've done so. So let's see, we've got a couple minutes left before it's turnover. We're not in a rush to get out because we don't have another class immediately after us, but I'm gonna stop the recording.